As you may imagine, the word werewolf comes from the Old English compound of were meaning man and wolf meaning, well, wolf. Now, although this is certainly the clearest definitive origin of the term, there are other far older origins of similar sorts of terms. Low Latin describes the Gerulphus, which the French later misheard as Garou, which means beware, harking back to their description of the iconic loup garou, a wolf to be aware of. But it's older than that still, and although the Norman Frankish described the Werewolf, Old Norse describes the Werwolf, or in much rarer terms the Ulfhedin, one in wolfskin. In modern Scandinavian there is even the Kveldulf, the evening wolf, considered to be derived from the name of the legendary Kvedulf Bjalfason, a historical Norse berserker from the 9th century. However, the actual term lycanthropy comes from an ancient Greek term as a compound of leukos meaning wolf and anthropos meaning human. Although the term doesn't appear until late antiquity, it is derived from a far more ancient one, therianthropy, the mythological act of metamorphosis and shapeshifting from a human to an animal that is as old as ancient Egyptian mythology, appearing in the mythos of myriad African and Eurasian cultures and folklore, from ancient Mesoamerica to the Kingdom of China. As it seems, the act of transforming from a human being to a primal creature has played an integral part in the methods of our ancient oral and recorded traditions. And here is where things get interesting, because although the origins of the term werewolf are ancient indeed, the archetypal European concept of the werewolf emerges from a very clear source, that being the ferociously feared warrior classes of the ancient Germanic tribes, many of whom revered the wolf as a potent symbol of both hunter and fighter. You see, the transformation from men into wolves was a wide held belief throughout Iron Age Europe, particularly in the Germanic sphere, often highlighted in their belief of Tierkrieger, also known as Woden or Odin in Norse, the leader of the wild hunt himself. Interestingly enough, it has also been noted that the metaphorical image of the widespread belief of wolf men in ancient Europe and the wider Indo-European sphere is directly correlated to the tribal transition of Europeans moving from fruit gathering to predatory hunting during the Iron Age, a forgotten cultural practice that was revered by ancient pagan European society. In 440 BC, the ancient Greek historian Herodotus in his histories described the Nuri, a tribe which he placed in the northeast of Scythia, where all of its members transformed into wolves once every year for several days, where they roamed the wild before changing back to their human forms. Now, in all likelihood, this was a tribe that is now part of Russia, and the tribespeople of the Nuri were most certainly using wolf skins and pelts for warmth during winter, but still, the metaphor is what's important here. Similarly, in the 2nd century BC, the Greek geographer Pausanias described the story of Lycaon, the king of Arcadia, who was transformed into a wolf following his ritualistic murder of a child. Lycaon's transformation was bestowed upon by Zeus after his attempt to serve him human flesh to discover if he truly was a god, depicting cannibalism and murder as a grave taboo, and the result being this primal, torturous prison. As written by Ovid in his Metamorphosis, describing the transformation of King Lycaon, he tried to speak, but his voice broke into an echoing howl. His ravening soul infected his jaws, his murderous longings were turned on the cattle, he still was possessed by bloodlust. His garments were changed to a shaggy coat and his arms into legs. He was now transformed into a wolf. However, although numerous are these references to man transforming to wolf in ancient literature, it is older than even that. You see, the first ever allusion to a man transforming into a wolf astoundingly dates back to the oldest surviving great work of literature in human history, the Epic of Gilgamesh, dating back to the 3rd dynasty of Ur, roughly around 2100 BC. Lycanthropy, as it seems, is a tale as old as time. But why? What is it of these monsters to men? What is this morbid fascination that many of our cultures have held with the act of this primalistic transformation? Inexplicably, as ancient history is often suggested, it occurred with the debasement of the human moral spirit, succumbing to the bloodthirsty primal urges of a violent act, murder, cannibalism, the sight of a frightful massacre, not in any sense of the martial or the art of war, because as we know, the ancient world certainly enjoyed a battle or two, but in the actions outside of what was considered moralistically sound of the time. And perhaps here is where the werewolf tale begins begins to take on its far more human sensibility. You see, the werewolf is a bizarre construct. It comes from a cultural function of damning, violent and bloodthirsty actions, but as Europe wrestled itself from the grip of the Roman Empire, the cultural myth of the werewolf seemed to expand into the role of almost a guardian of sorts, albeit one that was primed for feasting on human flesh. You see, the Germanic pagan traditions that we previously spoke of persisted longest throughout the Scandinavian Viking Age. King Harald Fairhair of Norway was said to have commanded his troop of Ulfhednar, often mentioned throughout the Volsunga saga, fearsome berserkers who wore the skins of wolves to channel the spirits of these ferocious animals to enhance their effectiveness in battle. This was continued in the traditional period of the Kievan Rus, a loose confederation of Slavic and Finnic peoples of Europe throughout the 9th to the mid-13th century, which would form the legendary Slavic mythology of the werewolf, one that is far different from the medieval depiction of the Lycan. Historically speaking, the legendary 11th century Belarusian prince Vleslav of Polotsk was very openly considered to have been a werewolf, reportedly capable of moving at superhuman speeds and proudly documented in the 12th century text, The Tale of Igor's Campaign. Here it was stated that Vleslav the prince judged men. As prince he ruled towns, but at night he prowled in the guise of a wolf. From Kiev prowling he reached before the cock's crew, Tumtakaran, the path of great sun. As a wolf prowling he crossed. For him in Polotsk they rang for matins early, at St. Sophia the bells, but he heard the ringing in Kiev. And so this is where we come to our most accurate understanding of the werewolf in modern horror fiction, one that was proliferated in the many tales that occurred throughout the dawn of medieval Europe. Burchard of Worms of the Holy Roman Empire spoke of werewolves that roamed the countryside murdering folk in their sleep. Later, Liutprand of Cremona allegedly spread a rumour that Prince Bahan, the only son of King Simeon of Bulgaria, could use his debased magic to transform into a wolf at will. On the other hand, in Marie de France's poem Bisclaveret, written in the year 1200, she describes a nobleman, Bizunet, who was cursed to transform into a wolf once every week. However, when his treacherous wife had stolen his clothing needed to restore his human form, he escaped the king's wolf hunt by imploring the king for mercy, and then as an act of penance accompanied the king as his own werewolf bodyguard. That's pretty damn interesting, right? Perhaps the Slavic traditions were rubbing off on them. You see, this is the beginning of the very clear duality now found of the werewolf in horror literature. On one hand, the Slavic reverence held for the Lycan as depicted through the ancient pagan traditions of Iron Age Europe, one that is not a werewolf in the same sense but a vlodglak, a wolfskin, which would later become associated with the concept of the revenant, the vampire, which is a hero to some and evil to others. But then on the other hand, we have the Germanic werewolf, or more importantly, the medieval werewolf, widely associated with the witchcraft panic beginning roughly around 1400 AD, a period of folklore history that hit its fever pitch in 16th century France and Germany. You see, here there were countless reports of werewolf attacks, hundreds of them in fact, court trials clearly recorded in history, and in some fewer cases clearly found evidence against the accused Lycan of both murder and cannibalism, which interestingly enough harkens back to the same fear that we found in the ancient Greek depictions of lycanthropy. Hey, I'm not saying that there's a direct correlation between the Holy Roman Empire and the medieval werewolf, but it's certainly interesting, and also it is. Accusations of lycanthropy were frequent in the Valais witch trials of 1428. In the canton of Vaud, which borders the cantons of Fribourg and Bern, numerous child-eating werewolves were reported through the year 1448. In 1598 in Anjou, a gang of werewolves were sighted roaming the rivers of the French lowlands, and in 1603 in Bordeaux, a teenage werewolf was sentenced to life imprisonment for the crimes of lycanthropy. Perhaps the most famous case of the medieval werewolf, though, came to the forefront with the bloodthirsty tale of Peter Stump, a German farmer and alleged cannibalistic serial killer reported to have murdered and eaten over 18 victims, including 14 children and 2 pregnant women, after the devil himself had allegedly given him a werewolf girdle of black magic which bestowed upon him the all-consuming power and hunger of a wolf. Peter Stump, otherwise known as the Werewolf of Bedburg, is perhaps the root form of what we now consider to be the classic werewolf of horror literature and cinema, but interestingly enough, it is one that focuses exclusively on the violent and bloodthirsty nature of a man who is caught physically or metaphorically transforming into a beast. Interestingly enough though, more often than not, the modern werewolf has often become a sort of hybrid of these two dualistic components of the ancient Lycan, the conventions of which are just as much of a hodgepodge as its forebears were. Take, for example, the folklore depiction of silver being a repellent to a werewolf. You see, silver in folklore, particularly in Celtic folklore, is a very important trope, but as to where it came about in relation to lycanthropy, is anyone's guess. In 1640, as folklore tradition describes, the city of Greifswald in Germany was infested by a pack of werewolves, and as was written, a clever lad suggested that they gather all their silver buttons, goblets, belt buckles and so forth, and then melt them down into bullets for their muskets and pistols. This time it worked, and they slaughtered the creatures and rid Greifswald of the lycanthropes. You see, in many ways the fiction of the werewolf is a constant work in progress, constantly grabbing different components of folklore, superstition, mysticism and religion and piling it atop the wolfskin legend. In that regard, the werewolf is perhaps the most forward-thinking horror convention ever known. In The White Wolf of the Harz Mountains, a short story appearing in the Phantom Ship written in 1839 by Frederick Marryat, the first ever demonic femme fatale was penned, one that this time transformed itself from woman into wolf. This trope would occur sparingly throughout Gothic literature, but after the 1970s, particularly following Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber and her short story The Company of Wolves written in 1979, the female lycanthrope changed the game once more, culminating in Ginger Snaps, released in the year 2000, which is freaking awesome, and then again with 2011's Red Riding Hood, which isn't great, but it highlights my point. Taking these themes and then applying the transformation of lycanthropy to that of sexuality and a transgressive discovery of the South, highlighting the liberation that comes from championing the natural form. And again here, the concept of the werewolf in culture has often been used to highlight a sort of social movement of sorts, be it one that is taboo like the werewolf of medieval Europe, describing the fears of serial killers and cannibalistic monsters, or the satanic panic of witchcraft by the Holy Roman Empire, or on the other hand, one of a cultural advocacy and guardianship like that of the Slavic werewolf, who harness the more primal urges of the human form to their advantage, often as a force for good in defense of their own tribe or people. You see, be it monster or man, so it seems that the duality of the werewolf has long lingered in the hearts of humanity for thousands of years, and will perhaps linger for thousands of years more. After all, aren't we just wild animals howling at the moon? And it kind of makes me sad, because I'm torn in two by this movie, much like the human victims of the titular Wolfman, or Wolfmen in this case. You see, this film had so much potential to be brilliant, and I'm not quite sure exactly where it went wrong, but still, fear not, because the most important thing for you Top 5 Scary viewers though, is that this film is bloody, filled with gore and grotesque transformations, and from a visual perspective, it hits every box when it comes to what we expect from werewolf horror. Also, the cast is absolutely stacked, and it's almost impressive in itself that a film with such acting pedigree flopped so massively at the box office. Benicio del Toro, Sir Anthony Hopkins, Emily Blunt, Hugo Weaving. Yeah, some really big names. Written by David South and based upon the 1941 werewolf classic of the same name, The Wolfman tells the tale of a Victorian man, Lawrence Talbot, played by the awesome Benicio del Toro, who is fantastic in this film despite its critical review, that returns home to his estranged father, played by the legendary Sir Anthony Hopkins, only to discover that there's something lurking deep beneath the family tree. You see, the plot is simple, perhaps too simple in its approach for a remake of a film from 1941, but I think the reason that this film didn't exactly strike a chord where it was meant to was partly because of the ending and its resolution, which of course I won't spoil for you, but actually really makes sense. Still, Benicio del Toro produced this film himself, and he put so much love into it, as it was one of his first inspirations as an actor, and he was a massive fan of the original Wolfmen, and you can tell. And that alone is reason enough to watch 2010's The Wolfman, because most of all, it's fun. Transformations, howling at the moon, Benicio del Toro ripping people's throats off. Yeah, we're spoiled for choice. Also, Max von Sydow makes a cameo in the director's cut, so there's another reason. Coming in at number 4, Where? 2013.
Oh, what a good boy. What's he doing?
Here, stay close to your dad.
And in complete flip reverse to 2010's The Wolfman, this film in particular decided to pay its dues to werewolf horror and approach the genre from a completely new direction, and for the most part, this film works to a frightening efficiency. In 2013's Where is very much a fresh, snarling breath of air for fans of lycanthropy. Much like how Afflicted did the same for the vampire genre, this film does the same for werewolves by giving them a worthy documentary-style entry into the halls of horror, although it kind of isn't that at all, and it technically isn't a found footage film. But still. Listen, this film definitely has its faults, and again, this film wasn't exactly heralded by critics as a game changer for horror, mainly down to its CGI, but come on, is far from being bad. The reason that this film is a success for fans of werewolves, aren't we all, is because, most importantly, Were is a monster movie. It very much has a clear villain, and that allows it to pull no punches with the throat-ripping and lycanthropic rampage. Written and directed by William Brent Bow, Were follows a crew of investigators who are tracking down the deaths of an American family after they were vacationing in a French countryside, and their bodies were found ripped to shreds. Of course, the strange, shadowy local loner that lives with his mother out in the woods quickly becomes the source of hot suspicion, and then we're off, rampaging our way across the city. There's not much more to it really. We watch werewolf horror movies to see a clawed feral lichen ravage their way across the screen, right? Where is that movie? And it's surprisingly great. Next up at number 3, Wolf, 1994.
Yeah, we all need some money.
I've got about $1,000 in my wallet. How much would you like to borrow? $5? 10?
And we touched upon this point in the first part of this video list series. More often than not, cinema has treated werewolf horror more so as a horror comedy, finding it difficult to balance the equal parts grotesque body horror with the reality of becoming a ravenous lycanthrope. And because of that, in the latter quarter of the 20th century, cinema approached werewolves with all the camp that they could throw at it. But the 90s were a different time. The 90s was the time of romance, romantic comedies, romantic thrillers, and romantic horrors. Just like 1994's Wolf, and who better to play the lichen than the big bad wolf himself, Jack Nicholson. Listen, this film isn't your traditional werewolf horror. There's little of the vulgar thrill and excessive gore that we've come to love in the genre, but strangely, Wolf finds its intrigue within its exceptional cast and characterization. In fact, this film is perhaps the closest we've come to a mainstream depiction of werewolf horror, and because of that pedigree, it really does work. Wolf stars the legend that is Jack Nicholson as Will Randall, a highly successful editor-in-chief that subsequently gets bitten by a werewolf and loses his job pretty much in the same day. After getting betrayed by his best friend and colleague Stuart Swinton, played by James Spader, the pair quickly strike down a path that propagates who's who in the alpha males of both the wolf pack and the big city life of downtown Manhattan. Because the perfect foil to Jack's big bad wolf is of course James Spader, who is incredibly creepy in this film, and in fact the vast majority of the horror comes from his performance alone. You see, the best part about 1994's Wolf though is that the actual physical effects of the werewolves are second to none, and the plot takes itself seriously enough to segue the aforementioned camp by giving the borderline lichens reason to still maintain their human form. I won't say anything more, but surprisingly, Wolf really takes its folklore seriously, and that's a very good thing. Swinging in next at number 2, Howl, 2015. This film is great, and the fact that it's a British indie movie that went straight to DVD will probably do no wonders for the fact that it otherwise fell straight down the black hole void of surprisingly brilliant horror movies from the United Kingdom that didn't get the credit they deserved. You see, it should, because Howl is awesome, and it's very much in line with the pedigree of another British werewolf horror that made our part 1 list, Dog Soldiers. And guess what? This film is pretty much the second cousin of Dog Soldiers, as most of its production crew worked alongside Neil Marshall back in 2002, and this film's director, Paul Hyatt, was the guy who made the incredible prosthetics and physical effects of Marshall's werewolves. So that's reason alone to watch this film. And in fact, I think 2015's Howl may give Dog Soldiers a run for its money when it comes to the characterization of its lichens, because they are fantastically terrifying throughout this film. Also, Howl features the awesome Sean Pertwee in it, as in Wales from Dog Soldiers, albeit not for long. So yeah, another reason. Okay, I'll stop with the connections now. Much like Dog Soldiers, the brilliance of Howl is in its simplicity and its approach to the subgenre with respectful efficiency. There's not much to Howl really. A train breaks down in the middle of a forest in England during a full moon, and of course it's down to the down on his luck train conductor Joe, played by Ed Spielers, to try and keep his passengers alive. I'll say no more because there's not much more to ruin, but Howl is one of the most worthy werewolf experiences of recent times, and it's more than worth a watch. And finally, coming in at a number 1 spot, The Company of Wolves. considered by many to be the greatest werewolf film ever made. And come on guys, it may be just that, but I had to save some material for part 2, right? Because in many ways the Company of Wolves really is awesome, if not perhaps the truest Lycan folklore, down to the fact that it was written by one of the most astute minds in horror and magical realism, the late great Angela Carter. And if you haven't read her fantastic 1979 book The Bloody Chamber, stop what you're doing right now and do so, because for fans of top 5 scary videos that love nothing more than folklore and horror, it's a terrifying compendium of both of those things. The film itself is based upon the werewolf story that features in The Bloody Chamber, and true to her word, Carter saw through her vision to the silver screen. Essentially, this film is a retelling of Little Red Riding Hood, although obviously it peers much deeper beneath the darkness of its classic tale. The thing is though, The Company of Wolves is not a children's film in the traditional folklore sense, and it is definitely not an exploitation film either, perhaps in some kind of classic werewolf B-movie fashion. It's neither of those things, but it's also kind of both of those things at the same time. I think in many ways The Company of Wolves could have only been made during the specific age that it existed, and it very much is a product of its time, while still being an interpretation of a timeless tale. There's not much more to say really, there is just so much going on deep within the retelling of Rosaline and her long lost werewolf love that everyone's interpretation will be different. So in that case, I guess I'll leave it all for you all to interpret. Kicking off at number 5, Silver Bullet, 1985. You may sense a trend in this list, and it's that the early 80s seem to have a fervent desire to try and nail down the werewolf genre once and for all, and what better way to do that than with a tale from the king of horror himself, of the Stephen variety of course. Based on his novella Cycle of the Werewolf, Silver Bullet set out to capture that nostalgic, suburban coming-of-age miasma that Stephen King has so often perfected, and Silver Bullet is exactly that, whilst also just being a damn good horror film. Directed by Dan Attias with a screenplay from Stephen King himself, the film stars the one and only Corey Haim as Marty Kozlor, as well as none other than the legendary Gary Busey as his shambolically charming Uncle Red. The thing is though, Silver Bullet, whilst it manages to deliver some pretty decent, consistent spooks, is also a pretty hilarious horror comedy in parts, although perhaps at times it doesn't intend to be. Not only is it funny though, it also has a rare charm that is often found in some of King's similar works, particularly played out in the relationship between Marty and Uncle Red as they hunt down a werewolf plaguing their small town. It's a werewolf horror film and it's a Stephen King film, and that's good enough for me. Swinging in at number 4, The Howling, 1981. Talking of the 80s, now we're getting into some of the era's best. The fact that this film only comes in at number 4 might perturb some people, but believe me when I say that the next few films on this list are pretty tight. By the by though, 1981's The Howling is just a damn good movie, and when you look past the questionable performances, it's still an incredibly intelligent horror film. Directed by Joe Dante and based upon the Gary Brandon novel of the same name, The Howling tells the tale of a woman named Karen and her husband Bill, who are sent to the remote mountains of Los Angeles to a rehabilitation resort called The Colony. Well, you know what's what guys, this is a werewolf list, and of course turns out the colony is actually populated by ravenous werewolves hungry for human flesh, and their sole intention is to bite as many humans as possible to bolster their ranks. Also, although they may seem a little dated now, the special effects in this film from the legendary Rob Bottin were absolutely cutting edge stuff at the time, and it served as testament to the creative lengths that filmmakers can go with the intention of turning an actor into a furious, snarling Lycan. Werewolves, mountains, 80s blood and gore. Yeah, it's all good stuff. Coming up next at number 3, Dog Soldiers, 2001. And come on guys, I'm going to be a little bit biased here, but if you're asking me, there's only one British werewolf movie ever worth mentioning, and it's this one, 2001's Dog Soldiers, which kind of makes me feel a little bit old, actually. Nevertheless though, nostalgic werewolf movies aside, Dog Soldiers is just a fantastic action horror onslaught, and it's a must watch for any budding horror fanatic, and more importantly, it's quintessential British satire at its best, although you might need to sink your teeth in a little bit deeper to realise that. Written and directed by Neil Marshall, the man responsible for the awesome 2005 horror The Descent, Dog Soldiers tells the tale of a group of British soldiers out on a training exercise in the Scottish Highlands. Of course, turns out that they're being hunted by werewolves, but the thing that makes Dog Soldiers such a fantastic horror film is that Marshall does away with that worn out trope of boo-hoo, I'm a werewolf and it's super sad, why do I spend so much money on clothes, and instead just turns everything up to 11 and relies on some simple good old fashioned horror mathematics. Soldiers versus demonic wolf held dogmen. And because of that, it's awesome. Dog Soldiers is essentially Evil Dead, just with less questionable teenagers, more blood covered soldiers, and of course some horrifying man-eating werewolves. Next up at number 2, Ginger Snaps 2000. Ginger Snaps. What a film. What a fantastic teen horror tour de force filled to the brim with late 90s angst and of course puberty-based lycanthropy. The thing is though, just like how Dog Soldiers manages to depart its way from the tired tropes of werewolf horror, Ginger Snaps also did exactly that, just in a complete and utterly different direction, providing stark proof that you can still make a charming werewolf horror, you just have to do things a little bit weird. And that's what Ginger Snaps is. It's a calling card to all those kids that didn't quite fit in at school or had a macabre fascination with the darker sides of emotion or, you know, ended up getting bitten by a werewolf. Either or. Written and directed by John Fawcett, Ginger Snaps tells a tale of two teenage sisters, Bridget and Ginger Fitzgerald, who share a morbid fascination with death, a theme which binds them together on Ginger's transmorphic lycanthropic journey. Let's not pander lightly. Whilst being a fantastic horror film, Ginger Snaps serves as a vivid bare bones allegory for the trials and tribulations that young women face when growing up, and it plays wholeheartedly to that formula that if you want to make a damn good werewolf movie, you better be willing to do things a little bit differently. Also, it's got one of the most fitting soundtracks of all time. Yeah, Ginger Snaps, guys. Of course it makes this list. And finally, at our number 1 spot, An American Werewolf in London, 1981.
You gonna help me up or what?
I'm sure that you've all been watching this list waiting for the time that this one rears its ugly 80s head, because despite the point that I've been consistently trying to make, there is in fact one werewolf horror flick that earns the right to fully submit itself to those same tired tropes. This one, 1981's An American Werewolf in London, a complete and utter enigma that is far too horrifying to be a comedy and far too comedic to be a horror, but there in actual fact lies the true weird majesty of this film. Written and directed by the legendary National Lampooner John Landis, An American Werewolf was actually one of 3 werewolf movies that were all released in 1981. The Howling, which already made this list, Wolfen, which is great but isn't really a werewolf movie, and of course this one, which is perhaps the best werewolf movie ever made. But that's the thing, it doesn't even try to be. It somehow manages to be hilarious without even trying, while simultaneously being horrifying in the exact same moment. The main reason for that though are the genre-defining special effects from the legendary designer Rick Baker, who pretty much set the benchmark for his astounding physical depiction of a werewolf transformation. Let's not beat about the bush, the narrative for An American Werewolf is pretty cut and shut, but that's not why it's fantastic. It's in the tight dialogue, the zingy one-liners, the terrifying moments of body horror, and the point of no return that happens when a full moon looms ominously. Kicking off at number 5, Wolfgang von Überwald, Discworld. And it is music to my lowly ears to hear the name of the late great eternal imagination of one of the most unique and wholeheartedly distinct writers of recent times, Sir Terry Pratchett, right here on Top 5 Scary Videos. Rest in peace. And really, without detracting from the werewolfness of this list, it really is important to note the creative achievements of this brilliant man. Discworld is one of the most unique series ever created. And of course, in tune with that uniqueness, we have one of the rare occasions where Discworld got a non-tongue-in-cheek dose of horror. And how would Sir Terry do that? Of course, Nancy Werewolves. But obviously, fantasy Nancy Werewolves. You see, whilst we'll touch on this later, there is a literary vein often mined by writers when applied to lycanthropy, much similar to their vampiric counterparts. If you're an all-powerful bestial creature of myth and legend, more often than not, you treat people like trash and you want to take over the world. Go figure, right? The city of Ankh-Morpork is central to the Discworld series, and its protection is down to the City Watch. One of those watchmen is Captain Angua, who just so happens to be a kind and noble werewolf. His brother though, Wolfgang, he's a piece of work. You see, the two of them are descendants of a long line of werewolves, and because of that, Wolfgang believes in his divine right to superiority and domination. He views anything other than a pure-blood werewolf such as himself as an abomination, and so because of that, he believes it's pretty much open season when it comes to feasting on the peasantry. In his family's ancestral seat of Uberwald, which is Pratchett's home county of everything horror, Wolfgang steps up his master plan to take over Discworld in the most ruthless and relentless manner possible. During the event of the Fifth Elephant, Wolfgang reinstates the ancient rule of the game, where a human victim is chased for sport by a vicious and relentless pack of werewolves. Although similar to the age-old tactics of the aristocracy, Wolfgang's version of the game is rigged, and it's a pretty unsightly and unfair bloodbath. However, I'll leave you all to discover Wolfgang's ultimate fate. Take a look. Swinging in at number 4, Fenrir Greyback, Harry Potter. And you may be thinking, what the hell, Harry Potter? Jack, come on dude. But I'd say, hear me out, and also tone it down a bit, because when you actually hold a lens to this tooth and claw ridden character in particular, Fenrir Greyback is messed up. Put it this way, to cut a long story short, this guy didn't join Voldemort's cause because he believed in the Death Eater's ideological stance on wizarding superiority. He joined for one reason. If he allied himself with the Death Eaters, Fenrir would have a larger pool of potential victims to turn into other Lycans, particularly children. In his own words, bite them young and raise them away from their parents, raise them to hate normal wizards. That's messed up. Fenrir Greyback is a werewolf who is so bitter, twisted and corrupted by the fact that he was infected with lycanthropy that his sole purpose on Earth is to infect as many other innocent people, particularly kids, and inflict them with the same pain that he feels. Metaphors aside, I should reiterate that this is a children's book. Yeah, and it doesn't stop there, because it gets personal. As the series explains, Remus Lupin, the kind and noble protector of Harry Potter throughout the later novels, who just so happens to also be a Lycan, was in turn infected by Fenrir. But do you know why? It wasn't just a chance occurrence that Mr. Lupin was a Lycan, it was because when he was a kid, Remus's father, Lyle Lupin, who was an employee at the Ministry of Magic, publicly stated that werewolves deserved nothing less than death following the murder of 2 innocent Muggle children at the hands of Fenrir and his werewolf pack. When Fenrir heard those remarks, you know what he did? He didn't get revenge on Lyle, the guy who said it. He waited, bided his time, and on Remus's 5th birthday, he snuck in his bedroom, attacked him, and bit him, infecting him as a werewolf for the rest of his life. He infected the guy's infant child on his birthday. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear that Fenrir Greyback is an evil and vile werewolf that holds a grudge, but compared to some of the most evil of his literary counterparts, this guy makes it personal. And it's messed up. Next up at number 3, The Howling. And yeah, I do mean the whole novel, because although there are a few terrifying individuals in particular, the entire village of Drago, California deserves its spot on this list. And we're also going to slap on The Howling 2 on this list, because Gary Brandner's series only proves to get grosser and grosser the more Lycan scar tissue that's added. And it's a little bit confusing really, because it's important to note that the 3rd entry of the Howling series, 1985's Echoes, completely rewrites the events of the first 2 books, which is an odd thing for an author to do, but forget about that. We've got Roy and Marcia to contend with, and they're pretty angry. First released in 1977 and written by Gary Brandner, in some sense, The Howling is perhaps the most tame depiction of Lycans on this list, but it's in the savagery and innate will to commit violence far removed from the rationale of the human mind that allows it to earn its spot here. There is no humanity left behind in this series, just the primal hunger of the beast. It's a difficult trait to pull off, but when it's done right, it's certainly effective. You see, other than some pretty painful transformations, the werewolves in the Howling series are pretty cut and shut. For the most part, they're wolves. Not at all like their depiction in the 1981 movie of the same name, which you may or may not be aware of. And yeah, side note, that movie's awesome. But despite that, these wolves are phenomenally written, aptly taking their literary space as completely different creatures. You see, part of the curious allure of lycanthropy is the humanoid remnants left behind, that otherwise human form, albeit far more toothy and far more hairy. In Brandner's novel, however, all of that is done away with, and in the wild, particularly in the mountain region of Drago, California, the howling herd on the edge of town could be man or wolf alike, and that's exactly where they want you. Also, that's without detailing the bleak tragedy told throughout the events of the first novel, which is pretty far-flung from the events of the film, and you should certainly give it a read if you haven't. But it's in the second novel where Brandner really takes a terrifying turn in the mechanics of these visceral werewolves, and no spoilers, but if you're waiting for some kind of anthropomorphics, yeah, The Howling 2 has a sort of version of that. Pretty gross. Coming in at number 2, lycanthrope vampiri, necroscope. And yeah, I'm not entirely sure what else to call them, because if you're expecting this list to be exclusively non-vampire, I hate to break it to you, but Brian Lumley has something to say on the matter. And admittedly, whilst it may be a little sacrilege to honour the Crimson Lords here, the necroscope version of lycanthropy truly is something else entirely. As a brief overview to Brian Lumley's phenomenal horror fantasy series, vampires in necroscope are a species known as the vampiri, an ancient species of creature from an alien dimension known as Starside, Sunside, who have existed on our world for millennia through the use of 2 interdimensional portals. Their vampirism is bestowed upon them by a sort of leech-like parasite that forms a symbiotic bond, granting them an infinite lifespan, untold powers, and the need to sustain it all by means of blood. Pretty cool, right? Well, that same leech, in several cases throughout the vampiri's history, has a tendency to infect non-human creatures, often wolves or foxes, which, in the technicalities of this list, certainly adhere to the principles of lycanthropy. You see, in several cases, these vampiri wolves can assume a human-esque form to lure prey toward them, to infect and further spread their leech, as is seen with the Dweller. However, in other cases, true lycans have been bred purposefully by means of infecting the vampiri egg with the vampiric disease of lycanthropy, in most cases to horrific and immensely powerful results. One of those resulting vampire-werewolf hybrids was Radu Lycan, the Dog Lord, who was exiled from Sunside Starside to Earth, where he resigned himself in classic werewolf fashion to dominating the planet and spreading his unique vampiri leech to a new unified empire of werewolf vampires. Sensing a theme here. Now, whilst Radu is an exception, as well as several other minor characters, it's also important to note that lycanthropy in this series more often than not goes wrong, and the results are, well, completely and utterly horrifying, and also disgusting. Yeah, definitely sensing a theme here. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, the Garou, World of Darkness. And you know what, guys? I saw so many of you passionately advocating for this entry to make up our list, and I'll hold my hands up and admit, I'm sold. I'm completely sold. After delving into the inner workings of Werewolf the Apocalypse and Werewolf the Forsaken, I'm relatively certain that the Garou are some of the most complete and utterly compelling monsters of horror ever penned. And I say penned in the loose term because although there are a vast wealth of novels written in this universe, the bulk of World of Darkness is based upon a fantasy tabletop series, which you may be familiar with, particularly if you're a fan of Vampire the Masquerade. But that's by the by, because I'm fairly certain that we can all agree on one thing. Tabletop is literature. If it's of a written form, it's literature. It doesn't have to be a novel penned in 1887 for it to be worthy of merit. It just has to be good. And believe me, the Garou certainly earned their place at the top of the pile. Although relatively difficult to get a hold of now, the subsequent werewolf novels of the series detailed the origin of the titular Garou, and conceptually speaking, it bites a little bit closer to the bone than the rest of them. As told in Garou oral history, this secret civilization of lycans have always existed, clawing onto their existence by means of their eternal duty to Gaia, maintaining the balance of nature. Essentially, what sets the Garou apart is that they are the arbiter of humanity. If human civilization gets too out of control, the Garou sweep in and cull an out-of-control population. In its purest form, World of Darkness lays out the true meaning of the lycan and their human counterparts, the hunter and the hunted. And not only that, but these eternal predators have established complete mastery of their transformation, harnessing the ability to pretty much appear as any werewolf that you've ever seen in fiction. Their tribes are numerous, they have complete and utter domination over their planet, and in the truest terms, the Garou are a literal force of nature. Kicking off at number 5, the Pack from The Pack. And yeah, because I'm not sure what else we could exactly call them. The thing is, I think it's best that we kick off this list with an otherwise undiscovered gem, because for the most part when it comes to werewolves in literature, you have to do a little digging to find anything that's worth its salt, or fur, I guess. In The Pack, written by Paul Hinton and released back in 2013, werewolves, although still depicted in their traditional form, kind of are an entirely different force of nature. If you'd like an idea as to the bones of this novel, picture 30 Days of Night but put werewolves in it, and then stick it in a small town in England. The Pack tells a tale of a fictional town called Whitchurch, tucked in the idyllic landscape of rural England. However, in this little town, it has a very bizarre history, soaked in blood and the misfortune of an ancient curse. You see, every 15 years, a vicious pack of werewolves that are genuinely terrifying in parts, may I add, are unleashed upon Whitchurch to feast upon the locals. And yeah, as you may imagine, that that's exactly how this novel kicks off. Listen, I can't exactly heap a huge amount of praise on the actual technical construction of this novel, because for the most part Hinton's style is incredibly simplistic and the dialogue heavy nature of the novel is dragging in parts, but honestly, the werewolves in this novel are awesome, and it's worthwhile just to experience that. They're unlike pretty much every other werewolf in literature. They're like a force of nature, more akin to the vampires of 30 Days of Night than anything else. Also, if you enjoyed Neil Marshall's awesome movie Dog Soldiers, then you will adore this book. It's got the same British charm to it and a similar set of true grit characters. Yeah, The Pack. It's worth a read. Swinging in at number 4, Reverend Lowe, The Cycle of the Werewolf. And yeah, we can't really make this list without giving reference to the main man himself, Stephen King. You see, out of all of the entries on this list, Stephen King's The Cycle of the Werewolf is perhaps the most traditional depiction of lycanthropy. And yeah, I'm not entirely sure how he does it, because much like with the vampires in Salem's Lot, King manages to turn such a traditional horror trope into a completely different vessel for fear. But hey, I guess that's why he's the king of horror, right? For those of you that haven't yet read The Cycle of the Werewolf, please do. It's a fantastic read. It's short enough to get through in a single sitting, and conceptually speaking, it's the definition of what being a werewolf is. Also, yes, this is the King novel that 1985's Silver Bullet starring Corey Haim was based upon, so if it seems familiar, that's why. Written by Stephen King and illustrated by Bernie Ritson, The Cycle of the Werewolf is told across 12 chapters, each of them depicting a month of the calendar in the small town of Tarker's Mills, Maine. The story is told through the eyes of a 10-year-old boy, Marty Coslaw, who is paraplegic and wheelchair bound, and also the only one in his town who knows that a ravenous werewolf is murdering people every full moon. It doesn't take him long to realise that the werewolf is none other than Reverend Lester Lowe, the town's priest, although he himself isn't exactly aware. The thing is, the story is actually really sad, and King manages to walk a fine line between the bestial rage of the werewolf and the tragic realization of Reverend Lowe's curse. The origin of his lycanthropy is never fully explained, and that serves to hammer home the tragedy of his affliction, juxtaposed by the genuinely gut-wrenching physicalities of his killing spree. Yeah. This one is Werewolf 101. Next up at number 3, the lupine theriomorph, the Dresden Files. And yeah, something that isn't Werewolf 101 at all, because who better to completely reinvent the werewolf on several different levels than Jim Butcher himself. Now listen, you may be aware that we're big fans of the Dresden Files over here at Top 5 Scary Videos, but if you know, then you know, because the theriomorphs of the Dresden Files are awesome. And also, we have to hammer down the specifics here, because there's quite a few versions of the traditional werewolf as far as Butcher is concerned, much like with his varying depictions of vampires, as is the case with the Four Courts. In the world of Harry Dresden, there are several types of werewolf, otherwise known as lupine theriomorphs. There are the classic werewolves, which function exactly as they do in Gothic literature, terrible magic curse. You get the drift. But then there are the Hexen wolves, a type of lichen magic that allows a person to transform into a wolf-like beast through the use of a magical talisman imbued by another user. To transform, a person makes use of a talisman which can be worn and activated, and then, yeah, instant werewolf, or FBI werewolf. Usually it's a wolf hide bat, which are a pretty important resource in the world of Harry Dresden. Then there are the loups-garous, which are also incredibly similar to the classic werewolves, but instead are created by a much more powerful type of magic and are reliant on the old adage of the silver bullet variety. The loups-garous are essentially the resulting creation if you make enemies with really powerful sorcerers. And then there are the lycanthropes, which are essentially the anamorphic feather in Butcher's werewolf cap. As depicted in Full Moon, lycanthropes are not created but born, and for all intents and purposes are perhaps the most powerful lycans in the series. However, we're irking on spoilers here, but there are a few more versions of were-things in Butcher's series, which, you know, is reason enough to give it a read. Coming in at number 2, the Wolfen, Warhammer 40k. Okay guys, talk about diverging from the path of classic werewolfism. Of course it had to be the staggering canon of the grim darkness of Warhammer 40k to deliver us a completely insane depiction of the stereotypical werewolf. Because what happens when you cross an ancient race of lichen men with a space marine? Yeah, the Wolfen, that's exactly what you get. And if you know anything about the vast lore behind Warhammer 40k, you'll know that these guys are one of the most savage and frighteningly efficient fighting forces in the whole of the Space Marines. And also, the creation of the Wolfen is something else entirely, so much so that I'm pretty sure there is nothing else like it in werewolf fiction. Although it is kind of close to the Trial of the Grasses in the Witcher series, which is pretty cool, actually, and another reason to read The Witcher. As described in texts of the Terran Empire, the Wolfen are members of the Space Wolves chapter who have succumbed to the curse curse of the Wolfen and thus transformed into savage, malformed lupine mutants. Genetically engineered creations within every Space Wolf's gene seed is a specific genetic sequence known as the Canis helix, which unleashes the acute predatory sense of a race of creatures known as Fenrisian wolves, the native species of the Wolfen's homeworld, Fenris. Yeah, exactly, because how do you get an entire army of genetically engineered and technologically superior werewolf soldiers in the Warhammer universe? You create an entire planet of them. Now obviously if you're familiar with the series, you'll know that the Space Wolves are an incredibly powerful sect of Space Marines and by extension a critical arm of the Empire, but in this case Space Wolves is very much indeed taken literally. Space werewolves. There we have it. And finally coming in at number 1 spot, Karkaroth, the Silmarillion. Because yes, there is one werewolf that all others tremble at the very mention of, and surprisingly enough, it comes from an incredibly well-known series that isn't exactly renowned for its depiction of gothic horror tropes. J.R.R. Tolkien's legendary work of fantasy, The Lord of the Rings, was built upon by a very important side compendium, his 1977 posthumous novel, The Silmarillion, and we have that to thank for fully fleshing out Tolkien's world of Arda and the incredibly rich and in-depth lore of the First and Second Ages. In many ways, The Silmarillion is considered to be the Prose Edda or the Bible of the Lord of the Rings, and any such creation story in turn needs to have its villain. That villain is a figure known as Morgoth, the progenitor of all evil in Arda, and the one responsible for creating some of the most vile evils in the whole of Middle-earth. One of those is Ungoliant, the giant spider and mother of Shelob, and the other is Draugluin, the first of the werewolves. But in this case, they both pale in comparison to the power of Karkaroth, offspring of Draugluin and the greatest and most powerful werewolf to have ever lived. Otherwise known as the Red Maw and the Jaws of Thirst, his eyes burn like red coals and his teeth were poisoned as the spears of the Orcish legions. He was reared by Morgoth as a line of defense against Huan, the white wolfhound of the Valar, and was charged with defending the Gate of Angband, where he eventually went on a madness-induced warpath, slaying everything and anything that stood in his path. You see, the thing is, although Tolkien's depiction of werewolves aren't exactly in line with many of the other mechanics of the creatures, they are the literal definition of the primal rage and bestial wrath that werewolves represent. These werewolves aren't trapped men, but instead they're servants of evil itself, bred by Morgoth from wolves and then inhabited by spirits of pure evil. And Karkaroth, yeah, he's the baddest of them all.
Coming in at number 5, we've got the Wolf Strap. Like many other famous monsters, many folks assume that werewolves are usually the result of another werewolf attacking somebody. During a full moon, bites, scratches, and injuries can be extra worrisome, but being hunted down unsuccessfully by a lichen isn't the only way to join their ranks. Many legends tell of different objects that may assist people on their journeys to wolfdom. The most ubiquitous of these objects is the Wolf Strap. Basically a ceremonial belt, these lengths of leather can be used to transform someone into a werewolf. Put it on, you'll become a fearsome monster. It's not necessarily that simple though. First, you have to sell your soul to the devil. You have to know all the symbols to carve into the leather, and you have to frequently take care of it by rubbing herbs and oils on it. But if you're really interested in becoming a wolf and don't know any werewolves that would bite you, this might be the simplest method. Having an object of power such as a wolf strap leaves would-be werewolves pretty vulnerable when they're not in their bestial state though, so if you do take this route, make sure you've got a good hiding place. There's an old story from Russia concerning somebody with a wolf strap. A man lived way out near the farthest edge of the village and kept mostly to himself. People, as people tend to do, spun all sorts of crazy stories about this eccentric hermit. One night, while walking by his property after a fresh snow, a young lad noticed some strange tracks all around his house and barn. This was enough to pique the interest of some locals who came out to investigate. They found the tracks coming out from the front door of the house and leading into the woods. Suddenly, a howl ripped through the night. Some villagers immediately turned around and left, while other, braver folks decided to stick it out. When the man returned home, they took him into custody and searched his house. In a hidden chest, they found the engraved leather strap covered in oils and grease. What else to do but burn it all? Man included. Coming in at number 4, we've got the Werewolf of Bedburg. You may have heard of witch trials, but what about werewolf ones? Yep, folks used to get a whole party together to go out blaming people for the brutal deaths of livestock. Once someone was convinced a person was a werewolf, there was really nothing that could be done about it. Concerned citizens would arrest them, put them on trial, and torture them for hours on end until they got a confession. Whether any of what you confess is true is between the accused and God at that point. A famous trial comes from the tale of one Peter Stubb. For years, folks from Cologne and Bedburg lived in fear of wolf attacks. Dozens of people died in gruesome ways, often torn apart and partially eaten. Forensics weren't quite ready to be used effectively back then, so most people had to simply get on with their lives after any such attack. However, some people were stalwart in their belief that there was a werewolf causing all the carnage. Eventually, a group of determined villagers found a gigantic wolf and fought against it. They used spears and sticks to beat it back and eventually were victorious. The actual account of what happens next is strange and most likely unreliable, but that's what makes an urban legend fun, isn't it? Somehow it was discovered that Peter Stubb was the werewolf. He had been killing people, he'd been stealing the livestock, he'd been howling at the moon. Needless to say, the locals were shocked. This was probably the biggest news they'd ever experienced. And like 16th century folks tend to do, they decided that all new and strange things must be eliminated. So after torturing him for hours, he admitted to it all. He made a deal with the devil to acquire a wolf strap. He murdered 16 people, many of whom were children. He was the wolf those villagers fought. Then, of course, he was burned. What, they couldn't afford a silver bullet? Coming in at number 3, we've got a terrifying tailor. Werewolves tend to be associated with savagery. They're wolves, after all. They run around looking for prey and howling at the moon. And when they do find prey, they tear it apart and eat it raw. But not this werewolf. He is a classy lad. Known as the Tailor of Chalon, he ran a clothing store in a French village. When he wasn't mending clothes, he was luring children into his shop. He would torture them endlessly, and when he'd had enough, he would slit their throats. It doesn't stop there either. Instead of eating them raw, like most werewolves tend to do, he would boil them up and have them for supper. And if he was really in the mood for some raw flesh, he would head out into the nearby woods and stalk people in his wolf form. After dozens of children disappeared, the tailor was suspected of being behind it all. Folks raided his store and discovered barrels and barrels full of bones. Yikes. At least he was cleaning up after himself, right? Coming in at number 2, we've got the Revenge of the White Wolf. This legend is a little more up to interpretation than a lot of the others, so let me know if you think it was a werewolf or something else. Alright, there once was a butcher named Bill. He lived in a town a little off the beaten path. Naturally, there was plenty of wildlife around. However, the wolf population was rapidly becoming a major problem. Livestock was being torn apart, people were getting attacked by packs, and townsfolk were afraid to go anywhere outside. Bill, being a man of action, decided to do something about it. He gave up his butcher shop and became a full-time wolf hunter. Over the course of a few years, Bill managed to kill over 500 wolves, and he made a pretty penny doing so too. The community was safe, and Bill was well paid and well respected for doing his part, so all was well. Well, sort of. Bill felt pretty guilty for killing all those animals and taking such an exorbitant sum of money, but hey, what can you do? A few years later, another wolf came into town. A farmer described a gigantic white wolf, one that was too fast to even try to shoot. After it went around terrorizing townsfolk for a little while, Bill decided it was time to go wolf hunting again. He bought a little lamb as bait, tied it to a tree, and camped out with his rifle. After that, he went silent. His friends hadn't heard from him in weeks, so they decided to go looking for him. When they discovered his fate, a brand new type of fear washed over them. The little lamb was still tied to an oak tree, intact and alive, but Bill was not so lucky. He was propped up against the tree and missing most of the important flesh from his throat. Poor guy. After that, the white wolf was never seen again. And finally, at number 1, we've got the Bray Road Beast. Most of these stories have taken place in a far-off past, so for our last legend, I'll bring it into the modern age. Bray Road is near the town of Delavan in Wisconsin. A solid trek from Milwaukee, Delavan is mostly known for its lakes and parks. But the multiple werewolf sightings put it on the map in a different way. While driving along Bray Road, Dorothy Gibson hit something. She got out to investigate but didn't see anything at first. And suddenly, a huge hairy beast charged at her car. Terrified, she hopped in and drove off into the night. She shared this story and it gained some traction. In fact, many other people who had similar experiences came forth with their Bray Road Beast tales. Some folks had seen the beast on the side of the road, while others say they were actually chased by the creature. But when so many people claim to have witnessed the same pointy-eared monster on the same road, you have to start considering the possibility. Nobody seems to have managed to snap a picture of the beast, and sightings have gone down over the past little while. It was most active during the 90s, so maybe it just got a little too old by now. Regardless, that's the last thing you want to see when driving down the road late at night.